We should do a show because I have dinner.
Oh, all right. Sounds good.
You rat bastard.
I'm that way, man. You should know that by now. All right. So here we go. Today is Wednesday, November 25th, 2015, and this is episode 140 of the Defensive Security Podcast, also known as the Thanksgiving edition.
That's true. And thank you once again for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for being on the show. So, just a reminder, the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers. By the way, just kind of kicking off the show, I do want to make a correction to something I said last week.
Something that both of us should have caught.
Yeah.
And we just glazed over it.
Fat, dumb, and happy. Here we go. So,
see, what happens is once you hit number 5 on iTunes, our quality goes to crap.
That's true.
We don't even bother any. We're just coasting. We're just phoning it in. Skyping it in.
Skyping it in. That's right.
All right.
So
falling on our sword.
Yep. On our last episode, we talked about the J.P. Morgan, mega breach, which was actually a part of a big amalgamation of a crime syndicate. And I kept referring to banks as acquiring bank or as issuing banks as the ones that were being fined by the card brands. And actually, what I should have said was acquiring banks, because acquiring banks are the ones who accept money from potentially illegitimate sellers, and issuing banks are the ones who actually send you your credit card. So, sorry about that. Fall on my sword.
Yeah, and I work for a bank that does credit card processing. You would think I could have caught that.
Yeah,
but, it can be a 3-step system between the actual merchant and the Visa, MasterCards, American Expresses of the world. So,
yep.
So the acquirers, much like my employer, which is public knowledge. I work for a company called Elavon, which is a division of U.S. Bank. What we do is we are an acquirer. So we are the first step when you swipe a card or use it as an EMV card. It comes to our servers first. So, and everything I'm saying is public knowledge. There's nothing here that's confidential. This is all on our public website. So, in the instance of the story we were talking about last week, the concept is bad guys finding an acquirer and seeing if they can run cards through.
Right.
Basically as a merchant.
And it sounded like that some of those acquiring banks potentially were being complicit or at least cooperating to some extent.
Well, yeah, again, without talking about anything specific to my organization, most of the acquiring banks have extensive anti-fraud and fraud detection. So they're looking for these sorts of activities, as part of daily normal business and as part of their agreements with the various card brands and such. So for somebody to not be conducting anti-fraud or kind of turning a blind eye to fraud is definitely a no-no in that industry.
Yeah. And I think this one of the big headlines there, at least for me, was that some of these banks, were basically taking the hit from the card brands who would, basically fine the bank for acting inappropriately. And this, these people who now have been arrested were actually repaying the fine, and they had a whole system worked out. So,
yeah.
Anyway. That was last week. Thank you to Allie Miller for pointing out my error.
I'm sure this is not the only one we make. So our corrections portion of the show make it longer and longer as time goes on.
Yeah, I could take up the entire show. Maybe we'll just have every now and then we'll have an entire show that's a correction.
And then there'll be corrections to our corrections.
Yeah, and so on.
Why did we start that? Jeez.
So. Anyhow, let's get into our stories here. So our first one comes from healthcaredive.com. This is a story that's been banging around for a long time, and apparently it is coming to a end. So LabMD was a company here in Atlanta a couple of years ago. They got breached, and the FTC actually started going after them, saying that they were not exercising proper diligence and care of the data. And actually, LabMD in the ensuing time has gone out of business. They filed bankruptcy, and I know we've talked about this quite a lot because the FTC's been pretty activist with companies who have been breached and kind of going after them. And there's been lots of controversy because the FTC basically has no objective guidance. Right. All they'll do is basically say, well, you didn't do the right thing. We're not going to tell you what the right thing is. We'll just tell you when you didn't do the right thing. So anyway, the story here is that LabMD, who is only the second company to have fought an FTC action like this, Wyndham being the other one.
They fought the law, and the law
lost.
Oh!
So a judge has apparently rejected the FTC's action and sided with LabMD, who, ironically, is not around to benefit from this action. But I think the point of this article is that this, I think there's a legal body here who is opining on this, saying that this is potentially going to raise the bar for what the FTC does in the future. So there was I think kind of a concern in the industry that the FTC was going to get a lot more proactive, and now potentially this is going to change that. Although they do say that the article does say that they expect the FTC to appeal, so there may be more to come.
Which is interesting because the company's out of business, so I'm guessing it's really just the remnants of the company or who owns it, or whoever is holding the assets of the organization.
Right, and well, I suspect the FTC doesn't want that precedent sitting on the books.
Well, yeah, but they've already driven the company, well, not directly, but somewhat directly out of business. So,
well, I mean that's true, but they don't want the size of their hammer to be diminished by this. So.
That is true.
So anyway, more to come. This is I guess depending on where you sit politically, this is either a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a thing, and the FTC appeared to be one of the I guess few regulatory hammers, except for specific vertical industries like healthcare, which was chasing companies around who were not exercising due care. So,
in their opinion,
that's right.
The other thing is kind of completely off topic, but made me chuckle with this article, is you can tell we now have the OCC or the ADD basically generation, because the article starts with like 3 bullet points of, here's your briefing on this article. And then it gets into, if you want to go into insights, but it gives you like a really little snippet of like little sound bites of what the article is about at the beginning.
Which, I agree, because they do have a brief, which is 3 paragraphs, and then the actual article is another 4 paragraphs. So
yeah, okay,
yeah, yep.
Well, welcome to today's attention span.
That's right. So moving on to our next story is this one is from Data Breach Today, and the title is "What the J.P. Morgan Chase Breach Teaches Us." So there's a person interviewed here. His name is Chuck Eastham, I think is how you say his name, who has a pretty impressive resume, I guess. He has written 19 books, holds 6 patents, and 38 computer certifications. But the point he is trying to hammer home is, holy cow, how could J.P. Morgan not have encrypted their data? Now, I would like to point out, and we've talked about this not necessarily in the context of J.P. Morgan. We've talked about this in the context of other companies. In what's been reported relative to the J.P. Morgan breach is that the people whoever got this, well, we know who got in now, right? They got in apparently through some phishing emails. the systems that they targeted apparently were not being protected by two-factor authentication, and these attackers allegedly had administrative access to 90 servers in the JP Morgan environment. Administrative access, right? Want to point out that this is not like doing a SQLi dump of a database, right? This is, they had all the access they need to get.
So let's keep in mind, as you're saying, encryption has to be unlocked by something for it to be useful. And they had those keys.
Well, or we don't know for sure that they would have had the keys, but in all likelihood,
it is possible. It is possible to set up encryption in such a way that your admins don't have the ability to unencrypt it. But that is incredibly rare, and probably precedent-setting if somebody actually took that step where they didn't trust administrative accounts with the ability to decrypt.
Right.
Data.
Right. I think the point is if that's the threat that you are trying to cover, and I'm not saying that it's wrong, right? I mean, I agree with the fundamental premise that if you can encrypt the data and you can keep it out of the hands of the bad guys or girls, that's a good thing, and we should strive for that. However, I think the problem is that's a hell of a lot harder in practice than it seems because of the way we're getting attacked these days.
Right. We are, in essence, when we encrypt something, it's at rest, typically, right? There's 1,000 different ways to do this, but let's talk this through. What he's really talking about is data at rest encryption. Okay, great. But I still have to work with that data. So something have to have the ability to unencrypt that data and work with it. It could be the file system. It could be the hard drive itself. It could be the operating system level. It could be the application level. It could be row level. It could be file level encryption. But something somewhere has to work with that data. And if you've got somebody who's compromised your credentials, and if they've compromised, can't talk tonight, the credentials of somebody who has that permissions, the system will do exactly as designed and happily unencrypt that data and hand it to that user.
Yeah.
So how do you fight that?
Well, I think there are solutions out there. At some point, though,
I don't think it's an encryption problem. I think
it's not. It's not. I mean,
it's a privileged account management problem.
It is, and I think there are ways that you can continue to shrink the box around the data. Right? You can't ever really make it go away because at some point you're keeping the data for a reason. Somebody's going to have to access it, and that's just unavoidable. Because if that wasn't the case, don't keep the data. But you can do things. I mean, I know there are lots of encryption schemes which I think are much more complex, much more expensive, which rely on things like HSMs and whatnot. Where the keys are kind of squirreled away. But again, those are often associated with a user ID or a specific path into the data. Which again, if you're
really, what we're talking about is changing business practice to really fight this.
Exactly.
And, I would probably more fight this with monitoring, logging, behavior analysis, baselining behavior, and saying, wow, this admin suddenly is copying all this data out of this database or off this file system that we've never seen before. That's odd.
Yeah, I agree. Although the one thing I will say, and I'm starting to grow a little bit skeptical or concerned. Maybe not skeptical is not the right word, but if you do see that, is it too late? So it's great that that you detected it, but if they've already got the data, you haven't.
It depends on the size of data and how they plan to exfiltrate it, and
that's fair.
We're talking about huge amounts of data lately. I don't know that that's a bad thing, especially if you've got 24/7 SOC. You may be able to shut it down midstream. You may be able to really, really minimize your damage.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, at least you'll know. And knowing is half the battle.
Yeah, we still haven't figured out what the other half is, though.
Oh, yeah. Wow. I've got to rethink my entire childhood.
So, anyway, I guess the reason I wanted to talk about this one is it's really easy. It's an easy platitude to throw out in the context of an article to say, you know what, these breached companies, they should have been using encryption. But when you get under it, it's a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. And I don't disagree that that's a good approach, as long as it's designed in such a way that is, really addressing the problem. And
and let's keep in mind, encryption does help a lot of things. It definitely narrows the attack surface. It definitely makes it more difficult to get to data. We're not saying don't encrypt, but we're saying understand the paths in and out of that encrypted system and what has permissions to decrypt the data, and understand that that's typically what the bad guys are going for.
Exactly right.
But encryption is still very valuable. It's very appropriate. It also helps for lots of internal accidental misuse issues. And, we're not saying don't encrypt. We're just saying it's not a panacea. And you've got to understand what it's doing and not doing.
Yeah, exactly. So moving on to our next story, and this one comes from CSO Online, and the title is Damballa finds tools related to the malware that hit Sony. All right.
In just full disclosure, many moons ago, I did work at Damballa for about 1.5 years.
And anything bad that's happened to them was completely coincidental, right?
They did spell it wrong in the first sentence. I'm just saying, I like to be transparent.
Fair enough.
But that was 6-7 years ago now.
Jeez. So anyway, the deal here is that Damballa apparently found 2 specific tools, which, it's I guess never let a PR moment escape you, right? But
yeah, I would say the connection to Sony is a little sketchy here.
However, let's for a second suspend disbelief. And what they've apparently found is hanging out with the same family of malware that was allegedly used at Sony, called Distrover. They found 2 specific utilities. One is intended to timestamp, so basically allow some malware to completely reset the time of arbitrary files, which is great, if you're trying to hide some malware amongst a stack of files, because now it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. And then the other one was basically a log cleaner. It would basically go and allow the attackers to set kind of a start and end date, and would allow the Windows event logs to be purged for that specific.
The second one also could change checksums.
Yes.
Files, which I thought was actually more interesting than just changing a timestamp.
Right. But I think the point there is, at least with respect to the logs, get your logs off the system.
Yeah, no kidding.
Do not. I cannot tell you how concerning and how problematic this has been throughout my career when people keep the only copy of the logs on the system. And the system gets compromised, and you have no idea what the hell has gone wrong because the logs are gone, or at least they're suspect, right? Because
how can you trust them?
Yeah, this is simple stuff, very simple stuff. But also, I think the point is that, like you said, there's really trivial ways to change the date stamps and the checksums. So, those are not reliable indicators when you're checking out a system. So, not a lot more to say on that one.
Well, one thing I will say is that this shows that it is very easy to change the indicators of compromise for various pieces of malware, and that these malware exploit kits or whatnot are clearly equipped with this. So you've got to be careful what you're trusting. If you're trusting just looking for a checksum of an executable, that clearly isn't good enough.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, if you have any doubts about that, just Google the words antivirus evasion techniques.
Right.
And, go to town. It is not a complicated thing anymore. And in fact, there's actually, I think last week, we don't have any stories about this, but there was I think some online service will actually obfuscate your malware for you so that it's not detected by any antivirus. So, yeah. The next story we have is a long one, and it's not directly technical, I guess I'll say, but this comes from Slate.com, and the title is Inside the Sony Hack. Wow, let me try that again. Inside the Sony Hack. What it was like to be a rank-and-file Sony employee as the unprecedented cyber attack tore the company apart.
We talk a lot about the consequences of a breach. And we talk, we've sort of started to hint around, well, maybe it's not a fatal event. But I really thought this story kind of did a good job of showing the stakes of why what we do as Blue Team matters and why it's important and the impacts it does have on people.
Yeah. It's I think it's 3 pages long. It's a very long article, and it kind of gives the a somewhat blow by blow version of what happened throughout the attack, and from the time that it happened all the way through kind of earlier this year. Interesting stuff, like one of the things that was I thought was really interesting is that apparently the organization within Sony that got hit the hardest was their HR department.
Well, they were the ones definitely under the most stress.
Yeah.
When you think about it. One thing I thought was interesting too, and this feeds into that, is kind of building up to why the HR department was so impacted, is the morale and the communication problems that they had as this progressed. And the story does an interesting job of sort of laying out initially. People were kind of, pulling together, rah, we can overcome this. And this is an inconvenience, but we'll persevere and push through it. But then as it progressed, especially as there was threats to individuals in the organization, and people weren't necessarily sure if they were going to get paid on time, and they didn't know how much they needed to get paid, and people were getting cut checks incorrectly, and their personal information was getting leaked. A lot of people started to really turn on the company a little bit and start to get very frustrated, and that unity and sense of purpose and that sense of we're in this together, we're in this foxhole fighting this fight, definitely started to fracture. And the load on the HR department, who lost all of their systems in essence and had to go back to figuring everything out on paper and cutting manual checks, was apparently pretty huge, and company employee concerns. And the other thing that I thought was interesting, and this could be a little, I don't know, classist, but there's definitely was a feel, according to this article, for those who were the rank and file, that they were far more impacted and far more concerned than the leadership, and that the leadership sort of took it more in stride. And the subcontext, I thought, was, well, it's because the leadership makes more money and it's less impactful to them. I will argue, having been in a leadership role in a crisis, part of your expectation as a leader is to project that image.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Of calmness, and we will get through this and it will be okay. So I don't know that's necessarily a class thing so much as it is, rightly or wrongly, the expectation of leadership and the image that they're supposed to project during a crisis. Little bit of an aside, but
yeah,
because they started talking about things like the Sony employees were offered a year-long subscription to a fraud protection service called All Clear, whereas the more affluent employees went and bought LifeLock, which is the quote-unquote premier service and pricier. It's debatable, but whatever. Anyway, so there's definitely some underlying classist tones to this article. But what I thought was really interesting was, if we as Blue Team screw up badly, and we do have a hack to this extent, it really does have a meaningful impact on our employees.
Yeah, even though they didn't go out of business, I think that's a great point, because they talk about people will work in 6 or 7 days a week for 18 hours a day for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So this is, what we do is important.
I'd be curious of what their attrition rate was.
Most of the people I think they interviewed for the story were former employees, so I think it sounds like it was pretty bad.
I will say, somebody that I had shared this story with, who chooses not to be named, knows people at Sony at the time and says that they took issue with some of the accuracy of the story. So,
oh, really?
Didn't give me any other details, but
interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's helpful to bring that up or not, but take with a grain of salt, I guess. It's a bit of a he said, she said, and a bit of telephone going on here with, my brother's cousin's roommate's next door neighbor knew somebody who knew Ferris Bueller. But
well, it is interesting. None of the people they talked to would go on record.
Yeah.
Basically saying, and the reason given was that, if you speak out against your if you speak out against a studio, it kind of blacklists you in the entire industry. No one who would want to do that. So,
yeah, it's a fairly small industry when you get down to it.
Yeah, and I can't fault them for that, but at the same time, it does open the door for some, potential questionable reports. But whatever. It's a great read. They're still in business, still releasing movies. And again, look, you can't get hit any harder than Sony got hit.
Yeah.
Right. And at least from a IT perspective, and they're still kicking. So I do wonder if we need to kind of step back and refactor our, the FUD machine a little.
It makes for a hell of a DR case study too.
It does. And I'll tell you, I think a lot of organizations have, kind of like when Snowden did his thing, and contractors were all the rage. Oh my God, if we can't have contractors have access to our intellectual property, that's just terrible. I do think you're right that this is this kind of case is being war gamed out in a lot of organizations.
But then you have to come back to what's the likelihood and how much are you willing to spend
to
counter this?
Yeah, exactly. How many times has this happened?
Yeah.
It's happened like 3 times.
It's like trying to build your environment to defend against NSA. You're not going to reasonably with the costs that would entail. And
yeah,
if you're worried about the NSA, you're in trouble. That's all I can say.
I do wonder if
for the average corporation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on the NSA front. I mean, I think you should do the what's reasonable for your organization, but if you get too laser focused on defending against the NSA, you're going to lose not only are you going to lose the war, but you're not going to be focusing on the right things. But I do wonder in thinking about the Sony style attack is whether insurance is a reasonable mitigation, and I actually don't know if they had insurance. I wasn't very clear.
Well, that's an interesting question. So insurance doesn't mitigate for your employees being worked into the ground and burning out. Insurance doesn't mitigate for morale issues. Insurance doesn't mitigate for productivity issues, turnover.
No, that's true.
Trust. There's a whole lot of things that insurance doesn't fix in the short term. Maybe in the long term.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more in the long term, and maybe in terms of recovery, right? So,
yeah.
The one thing that struck me too is that their DR plan wasn't real robust. And I know, having hung around the banking sector for a while, like the FFIC recently earlier this year, they came out with some updated guidance, which I think, maybe this is the impetus for that guidance. I'm not really sure, but they're kind of coming to recognize that one of the attack vectors is data destruction, which if you have, let's say, a replicated set, you got a primary data center that does a replica to an offsite location, and that works great if the thing you're trying to cover for is that data center, going up and in flames, right? But if someone attacks your systems and corrupts your data, that corruption is going to get replicated across.
Yeah.
Now, I've not heard anything about the DR capability of Sony. However, having read this article and some other things, it seems to me like they had nothing. They had nothing. And
admittedly, we do not have all knowledge of Sony's environment.
Well, that's true, but they talked about having to stand up a temporary email system like a month after the attack. So it's pretty clear to me either they didn't trust their backup systems or their recovery systems, or they had they weren't there, or they were also impacted. And so I think one of the takeaways for me is this is a scenario, I guess, that you can kind of put into the design of your disaster recovery capability.
Yeah.
And I don't know that. Look, from a workstation perspective, that's a possibility, right? But I mean, as an IT guy, as a long-time IT guy, the one thing that struck me since day one has been that it just feels unacceptable that their entire environment, the infrastructure side, was so heavily impacted and unrecoverable.
But is it that rare? If your DR, for instance, let's say you've got two main data centers, and let's say they've got one in LA and they've got another one, I don't know, in Denver, and they're up and they're hot, and the impact impacted everything. Your DR just went with it. So you almost have to have a cold, offline DR environment, which I don't know how many people do that anymore, especially in the age of virtualization and SAN systems that can auto-replicate, and I don't know.
But I think that's the question, though, right? Is that right?
DR is focused on a local disaster taking out a data center, not necessarily a system-wide or enterprise-wide malware attack right now.
Yeah, but so let's just think about it for a second, because the Sony style, or Shamoon in Saudi Aramco, or the Dark Soul in South Korea, it doesn't have to be that. It could be somebody clicks on a CryptoLocker email and they happen to, let's just say it's one of your IT people, and they encrypt one of your file servers. Well, okay, that file server is now replicated off to your hot site. Well, what are you going to do now? And I guess my point is, I think there's a movement afoot, and not necessarily specific to the Sony style attack, but there is a definite movement afoot that is destroying data, rather than just DDoSes and that sort of thing. And I guess my point is, we ought to really start thinking about that about that in the context of our DR plans, and that's all.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I guess what I'm saying is, I thought your comment was a little harsh, that they shame on them for not, because I don't think many people are today. Now, I agree with you, we should be, but I don't think many people are today.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm being overly harsh, but then again, you know what? I'm a big internet jerk, so.
People like to see us fight on the show. This drama they come here for.
That's right. So.
Man, you're so lame. You probably still use VI.
Oh, yeah, and you get
where it's at.
Yeah, I figured you'd be an Emacs guy. Makes sense to me now. All right, so our last story for tonight.
We lost half our audience there. Sorry.
Yeah,
all right, bring it back.
The last story for tonight comes from, and by the way, Andy and I have been friends for way too long, so
it's true. Since the dinosaurs roamed.
That's right. We were flying around on pterodactyls at one point, right?
And we were good at it.
That's right. So
one of these days we will have to tell some more stories, but
yes,
we have to wait for some people to die, because otherwise they'll sue us.
True. Oh, boy. And then if they... Oh, never. I'm not even going to go there. So, our last story for tonight comes from Krebs on Security, and the title is Breach at IT Automation Firm Landesk. So this is kind of hot off the presses. So Landesk, Landesk was big when I ran IT back, shortly after the end of the dinosaur era.
It's true. You were back on punch cards, weren't you?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So anyway, Landesk is a company. If you're not familiar with them, they do a lot of kind of IT automation type stuff. I think a lot of their stuff competes with like SCCM and that sort of thing. So apparently they got owned pretty hard. Some of this, by the way, is information that comes from an anonymous inside source. But apparently they were owned for, I think, 17 months, starting in June 2014, if this source is correct. And they apparently also, in addition to having potentially accessed some employee information, it sounds like they also accessed source code.
For the record, by the way, we are referencing a Krebs on security article.
I thought I did say that.
I don't know that you did. You might have, but I don't really pay attention to what you're saying.
Well, that's clear. So,
are we still recording?
No, we stopped a while ago.
Excellent.
So yeah, let's see. So 40 gigabytes, in fact, of information apparently was taken off of some staging development servers and put up onto a website, which it was in turn exfiltrated off of, which apparently the active exfiltrating that big mountain of data is what caused people to notice the internet connection was slow, and in turn prompted people to start looking around. And one developer noticed the IT department was logged into his development server and said, "What the heck are you doing? I'm not logged into your server. What are you talking about?" And it kind of unraveled from there, apparently.
So what we're really saying, if the bad guys had just metered their bandwidth a little better, nobody would have noticed.
That's right.
Oh,
don't get greedy, guys.
We're not supposed to tell them that. Shh.
Oh, yeah. So it's
dwell time 17 months. Again, this seems to be a common theme, and we suck at spotting bad guys when they're hanging out.
Especially for that long. I mean, that's a long time.
To be fair, we don't know that the bad guys were active all 17 months. They could have broken in and gone quiet. They could have, who knows? We don't know what they were doing.
That's right.
They could have been noisy. They could have been not noisy. But, geez.
Yeah, there is there's a really interesting thing, and I want to find this. So I'm not going to say this. I'm just going to read this. So this is not my opinion. The implication, and this is a quote, "The implications are potentially far-reaching. This breach happened more than a year and a half ago, during which time several versions and fixes of Landesk software have been released. Landesk has thousands of customers in all areas of commerce. By compromising Landesk and embedding a backdoor directly in their source code, the attackers could have access to a large number of computers and servers worldwide."
Now, we don't know that a backdoor has been planted. This is conjecture.
That's right. That's why I was very careful to say that was not my opinion. However, I think that this kind of goes back to the vendor management, right? Just think about that as a possibility. Holy cow!
But at some point, you have to trust somebody.
You do, but damn.
Yeah, I mean, this is what always made me chuckle about. Oh, we've got our source code in escrow, so and so. Like, really, who's got the skill set to do a deep dive on a couple million lines of code to find backdoors? Really?
Right. I mean, there's been crap hanging out in. I mean, it's not a backdoor, right? But there's been bad stuff hanging out in all kinds of open source stuff for a decade or more. So.
Yeah, so it's possible, but it's also possible they just stole data and didn't even think about planning backdoors. We don't know.
Well, exactly. I mean, apparently all we know is that they were stealing source code. I think the article, the Krebs, I suppose, is the one who was speculating this. I think the idea was was this like the end stage? They already did, they've been there for 17 months and they did other stuff, and now this is kind of the last, their last hurrah.
I'm curious how they found out when the intrusion began. Clearly, they must have some good logging they kept. That's gotta suck.
Yeah.
Their logs going, oh, it happened when?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Put the next backup in.
Yeah.
It's there too. Oh. Yeah, so that one, just to answer that question, and this is a quote, according to a LANDesk employee who spoke on condition of anonymity, the breach was discovered quite recently, but system logs show the attackers first broke into LANDesk's network 17 months ago in June 2014. And that's all we know, right? There's no more specificity. But he does go on to say the employee, we'll call him John, said the company only noticed the intrusion when several coworkers started complaining of slow internet speeds. A LANDesk software developer later found that someone in the IT department had been logging into his build server, and so he asked them about it. The IT department said they knew nothing of the issue. Yeah. Yeah.
Sad. So sad. This brings up a good point, which is just basics. If they had a basic to alarm, a basic monitoring system alarm when bandwidth is being overutilized, go hunt that down. You shouldn't have to wait for your users to complain.
Right. Or if your IT department has no business logging into your build servers, maybe you could have noticed that a while earlier.
That's a lot to ask of a developer.
I'm not saying that. I guess I'm more on the point that maybe you should put a harness on, some kind of a test harness or security harness on your build systems.
Oh, I see. Yeah. And there may be reasons. They might be doing authenticated scans for vulnerabilities or whatever. Who knows? But
we don't know that. Maybe they did. I mean, we really don't know.
It goes back to the assumption that a lot of organizations have is when they build things, they build it with IT convenience in mind, not security.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So, and we're paranoid, cynical old coots, so we think about these things.
True.
I'm trying not to make you have to bleep out so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate your sacrifice.
I almost went on a string of vulgarity right there, just to make you work harder.
Well, on that note, I think we'll cut it off while we're still ahead.
Hey, and for our listeners in the U.S. or U.S. territories, or just enjoying U.S. customs, happy Thanksgiving.
That's right.
For the rest of the world, this is the holiday we celebrate when the Pilgrims came over and gave plague blankets to the Native Americans.
Oh, my God. I can't believe you just said that.
No,
that
right?
was not... No.
Is that Columbus Day?
Yes.
Oh, my bad.
Jeez. Can't take you anywhere. Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you still listen next time.
See.
Andy will be having a meeting with the HR department later.
Again.
And thank you again for listening, and we'll talk again next time. In the meantime, you can find links to the show or to the stories we talk about tonight on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Kallett on Twitter at Lurg, and I don't know what to say, but anyway. And then me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And with that, we'll talk again next week.
Have a great week, everybody. Thanks for listening.
See ya. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.